so we are live. This is Shady Oak, and I am joined here today by WireMother.
Hey,
We will
fellas.
refer to him as Wire, and our neutral moderator will be known as Retro. And we appreciate all of your guys' participation in these things. Just as a little note for those of you following on YouTube, the goal of this debate isn't necessarily to get my video taken down or to necessarily debunk any of the points made, but to simply give a dramatic presentation of the fact that we can still disagree and do so agreeably. Now, the topic today is a debate on My Life as a Teenage Robot, the study that was done on the show. And the debate topic will be, did Shady Oak misrepresent XJ9 as a biblical example of slavery? Moderator, could you please go over the rules for us, and then we can get started with the introductory statements.
All right, so I just read them out.
Yep.
Okay, well, no interruptions without permission. Stick to the allotted time, 15 minutes for opening statements, 15-minute rebuttal time, 3 sets of 2-minute Q&A sessions, and a 5-minute closing statement from each of you. No emotional attacks or pathless arguments, and provide minimum citation.
Is that fair, Wire?
Yeah, that's all fair.
Okay, well, now that the terms have been agreed to, I suppose since I'm on defense, I will be the first to respond. Is that okay?
Gladly. Go ahead.
All right, so starting my 15-minute time allotment, if any of you want to get a stopwatch, it is 9:06 and 35 seconds, so my time will end at 9:21.
Fez, can you get the stopwatch?
Hold on, see if I can find one.
Yeah, I'll have one on my
All
phone
right.
here just to keep myself accountable. All right, let me know
So,
when I can get started.
15 minutes?
Yep,
All right, when do we start?
just tell me when.
All right now.
All right. Before a word is said in defense of the points made in the study on My Life as a Teenage Robot, I think it's always more productive to clarify what my opponent and I agree on. First and foremost, I am in no way making the accusation that Rob Renzetti intentionally set out to make a biblically based story about a robot being treated like a human. Nor am I making the claim that the Bible necessarily was mentioned in the slightest during the writing, screenplay, and casting of the roles when producing the show. The foundation of my studies have always been based on the quality of information I present. If they line up with reality, then the facts are on the table. Whether intended or not, the information shows that the parallels between the show in question and the Bible will speak for themselves. We're here to address whether the quality of information I presented falls in line with the reality of what was presented in the show. Anything apart from the points and parallels made are simply an opinion and only worth about as much as the paper they're printed on. My goal is to defend those points as they line up with the Bible, not the opinions about the presentation thereof. So in laying this out, I have 3 points that I want to clarify in my opening statement that will hopefully set this in my time frame. The first term that needs to be clarified in order to preserve the core claims of my study is the title of the show itself. The show is titled My Life as a Teenage Robot, and noting the first parallel between XJ9 and the biblical slave starts with the origin of the term robot itself. According to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, robots by definition are always associated with machines to replicate human movements or functions. Now, with some digging, I could make my point off of this, but clarity is king. My point wasn't based on the definition of robot, but the etymology and historical origins or in development of the term robot. The online etymology dictionary, or etymonline.com, defines the word robot as first appearing in an English translation of Carol Capek's play Rossum's Universal Robots. The term used was from robotnik, which means forced worker in Czech, and it was also taken from the even more ancient Slavic term rabu, which simply means slave. So if XJ9's status as a robot or the origins of the term are in question, the reality of the show and history of the term, essentially, are where they would disagree. Second, I need to clarify the distinction that's made between chattel slavery and indentured slavery. Chattel slavery, according to freedomcenter.org, takes 5 forms that they regularly work to combat in their support of global abolition. And in the abolition of slavery, of course, they need to know the distinction between the two as well. Otherwise, we're outlawing employment. Chattel slavery takes the forms of the following: forced labor, debt labor, sex slavery, child slavery, and domestic servitude. It's also worth noting that there is a difference between debt labor as presented in the global stance as it stands today in the countries, for instance, like Sudan and Libya, where the Islamic slave trade is still alive and kicking. But there's also a point to make on this as well, that these are going beyond the legal contract. The slavery that we are presented to in the Bible would, of course, not fall in line with any of these. And the dictionary itself, that was cited previously, provides no alternative or especially no conflicting views on any of these as a possible term to fit in slavery. In each of these there lies a key feature that distincts it from biblical or indentured slavery. This would be the following: the recognition of human rights, as follows in the book of Exodus. Following the 10 Commandments in Exodus chapter 20, chapters 21 through 22 give the following prohibitions to a nation that has known nothing but slavery all of their lives, as they are now given legal status as a nation and moved into a life that no longer knew or permitted chattel slavery, like what they experienced in Egypt. See Exodus chapters 1 and chapter 5 for what that was like. Slaves in Israel could only serve a maximum of 6 years, thus not enslaved for life, like chattel slavery, could only serve under the condition of paying a debt, thus distinct from debt slavery defined by freedomcenter.org, in that the contracts are legally regulated. They could not be forced into slavery through kidnapping, since, as we read in Exodus chapters 20 through 22, that they would be executed if they were ever found kidnapping or with a kidnapped person. Also note this as well: if they were to be beaten in the point of causing any cosmetic harm, they were to be freed and forgiven of their debt. The debt owner has lost the right to own slavery, since they have failed to recognize a human right. Also note that they also carried this over to any slaves from foreign lands living in Israel. Humans were humans and would always be treated as such regardless of where they came from in the status or society that they held. Now, this was a sharp distinction from the Roman law that permitted the murder of slaves without consequence, according to the Annals of Tacitus and History by Plutarch. As we also saw in My Life as a Teenage Robot, in Episode 9, or rather the first half of Episode 5 in Season 1, Party Machine, Dr. Wakeman, and I quote, was aware that she was in fact a robot and would remain a teenager forever, but also gave her certain privileges that only a human teenager would have or want, i.e. the right to socialize, and I can give other examples, say the right to education in class action, and I was a preschool dropout, the right to participate in sports, Gridiron Glory was an example of that, where she was the quarterback, the right to pursue or refuse relationships in Attack the 5-Foot Geek and Dancing with My Shell. And in all of these, she was not only noted within all of these rights, but also, and this was the second point of my study, expected to serve a purpose, i.e. to protect the Earth from meteors in It Came From Next Door, the first episode of the series, in Invaders, as noted in Party Machine, cited previously, and also received consequences when those duties weren't fulfilled. We saw this in Raggedy Android with the second skin, call hating when Dr. Wakeman forced her to have to answer her little chest monitor screen every time that she called, and also noting in Return of the Raggedy Android when she was restricted from performing her duties as a crime-fighting robot, people were harmed. These are where the parallels were also noted. She had responsibilities like Wakeman's child, and as Galatians chapter 4 and verse 1 would note, a slave does not differ from a son, even though he is master of all, but is placed under tutors until the time deemed by the father. A child and a slave both have the rights as human beings would. but they are expected to do what they're told when they are told, just like biblical slaves in XJ9 were. And so, finally wrapping this all up in my final point that's noted to clarify what a slave's job description is: someone with a purpose that exists with the intention of fulfilling it. If XJ9 doesn't exist as a crime-fighting robot, then I either misheard the intro to the show, or she exists in two worlds, given the strength of 1,070,000 men, and also noting orders from her mom to prevent aliens from, and I quote, annihilating us all, along with the desire to go to skate parks and make simple walks in the rain. This would be best defined as humanity, but with a purpose, responsibilities with rights, a biblical slave. So in my opening statement, I'll reiterate these points since I still do have time allotted, although I've said everything I think I need to say. First, the term that I clarified as far as the core claims of my study are in noting the origins of the term robot. The second are the notes of a slave having human rights, and thus that was the new introduced factor. In Exodus 21 through 22, noted it wouldn't be all the same rights as someone who was free, but granted definitely a step up from how other nations provided, and I gave citation in Rome. And of course the final point, the slave's job description is someone that exists with the intention of fulfilling it. Note, not the existence to only fulfill that purpose, but exists with that purpose. As far as what else could be noted and said, I think that is all that need be. So I'm willing to hand off the rest of my time, and I will conclude my opening statement with that.
Fez, I'm waiting for you.
All right. Well, if you're done, then I guess WireMother can go.
Right. Right. So just like Shady Oak wants to present that Jenny is a biblical representation of slavery, my opinion as an antithesis to the TV show is that Jenny is not a slave, but in fact she is as autonomous as everyone else in her neighborhood, and that this is not really a right that she should be able to have, and that in reality she is just property. Now, I know that might seem a bit cold-hearted, especially to those who are fans of the show, who may believe that Jenny deserves the rights of humans just like any of the rest of us do. But here is my argument. At the beginning, Shady Oak, he stated that the word robot came from the Czech writer Karel Čapek, and in his play Or You Or, which was translated into English. And this is true, because Czech is a Western Slavic language. The etymology of the word robot does come from Old Church Slavonic, which means rabu, yes, slave. And as a result, that also... See, I studied Russian for high school, and the word to work in Russian is работать, which means to work. You can comment that robots are built with a purpose, and of course, you know, that is true. However, I do not believe that Jenny is able to be considered a slave because she is not alive. She was built for a purpose just like anything else is. I do not believe that I can call my phone a slave when it was built for the purpose of telecommunication, nor can I call my computer a slave because its job is to browse the web. I believe that there are differentials that differentiate a human biblical slave and that of a machine. See, while in 145 of the video in question, Shady did state that modern-day slaves are replaced with machines. Well, I believe that it's very erroneous because that is the condition of being legally owned by someone else and forced to work for or obey them, as according to the Oxford Dictionary. But that can be attributed to anything. For example, my mug here is a, legally owned by me. and its job is to, hold coffee. Just like Jenny's job is to save the universe. Jenny's privileges as a teenage robot, to be quite frank, are just that, privileges. She is not able to have she is not required to have a social life. Noreen built her like that, and to be honest, there's really no mention of why Jenny was built as a teenage robot, rather than, just building a robot to save the world. But, without her being a teenager, there would be no show, would there? But nonetheless, she is a piece of property because she is not alive. She has no soul. She's not alive. She's black and hollow and cold inside. She is a machine. There are incentives, not rights. They are incentives for her to, take kids home from the high school and party all night. That is an incentive to do her job to save the world, which she does badly, may I add, because while Shady did state that people were harmed when she was off duty in the episode Revenge of Raggedy Android, I believe, we can see that in Labor Day, she was plugging herself into all this machinery, and she smashed the Seattle Space Needle, the Golden Gate Bridge, and the Statue of Liberty and Mount Rushmore in the course of 30 seconds, if not less. She has created the largest terrorist attack on the face of America ever since 9/11. So I don't think it would be proper to say that Jenny's job of saving the Earth is a very effective one when she's committing acts of domestic terrorism on her own doorstep and she's endangering human lives. She puts her friends in danger all the time. The reason that Queen Vexus invades Tremerton on the daily is because Jenny's existence. Her existence already endangers her own friends. We can also see that in the episode I Was a Preschool Dropout, it shows her attacking children with dodgeballs. Now, if we are to... Now, of course, Matthew 20:28 states that Jesus was serving man, and that's true. But I don't think there's a difference between serving man and trying to help him, rather than serving man and tossing dodgeballs at little children. Bombardment isn't the way of helping humanity. So we can go to show that if Jenny's true job, if her true purpose in life was to save the Earth, then why does she have the autonomy to assault little kids and beat up her friends? I don't believe that Jenny at all is a benevolent superhero, but in fact I believe that she is really the one that is the enslaver. However, I will leave that for later in my argument, because this evidence that I have is not as solid as the empirical evidence as seen in the show. We can see that now, Shady has stated that biblical slavery accounts towards if you say you're good at things and you ought to do them for the sake of others as well as yourself. And that's biblical slavery. I believe that's a quote that Shady said around 335. However, that is not the case. Because one, Jenny's not good at her job because she causes huge amounts of collateral damage. And secondly, we can see, and that's in Labor Day alone. That isn't including any other episodes. We can also see that in the pilot episode, Jenny outright states that she does not do things for the public welfare. She does it because of fear of her own mother. Her reprisals. She states that if Earth was destroyed, her mother will ground her forever. Jenny is not saving the world out of her own selflessness, altruism, or genuine sacrifice. She is doing it for the pure sake of incentive. She knows that if she does her job, she will be able to have the same privileges as any other teenager. But this is not the case, because she has to rely on opportunistic, events such as Brad smashing a baseball through her window in the pilot episode in order for her to actually achieve her teenage life. Jenny then, despite the fact that she has to save the Earth, she can choose whether or not she can engage threats or neglect threats. As seen in the pilot episode, she chooses not to destroy the meteorite until it's nearly too late. Jenny, through her own volition, was able to choose whether or not a threat to Earth would be her business or not, despite the fact that there are institutions such as Skyway Patrol which are easily able to equip and deal with such situations. Because obviously, if Jenny's able to deal with it, none else can. Nobody else can. We don't have Skyway Patrol. We don't have any other superheroes. I believe that it would be completely erroneous to suggest that Jenny is the vanguard of the human race, if not an endangerment to it. I believe that's just my case anyway so far. I've said what I've needed to say, so I'm going to give up my time, the lot of time I have left. Fez?
All right. Guess it's your go, Shady Oak.
All right, I am unmuted. Thank you, Wire, for that introductory statement. So, noting and just clarifying the points that have been made, I'll begin my rebuttal by once again just noting what was said in the study. When we're talking about, of course, the things that XJ9 got right or wrong, that doesn't necessarily take away from her identity, because just like what would be noted as an altruistic employee or a negligent or even a constantly griping employee, I'd make the illustration an example of SpongeBob SquarePants. SpongeBob, of course, was an eager employee with a solid work ethic, and Squidward was a depressed, neglectful, and if oftentimes mediocre employee, but it didn't change the fact they both worked for Mr. Krabs. In the same way, I don't think it would change XJ9's identity in that her purpose was to protect humanity, even though her motives were, and let's face it, a lot like that of a human teenage girl, thus the identity in the show. You mentioned that XJ9 is not a slave, but would be more identified as property. Well, that's exactly the point. When we're talking about the status of someone who's a slave, they are considered for all legal benefits and terms as property, and the Book of Exodus itself even recognizes that. If a slave is disciplined and they aren't given any long-term lasting harm, the masters aren't to be punished because they are their property. Now note, it doesn't take away from their human rights, and the law of cosmetic restriction would still apply, but it didn't necessarily make it so that they were less than human. It just meant that they were in that place and at that time of the status of property, in that they were there in that person's house, not for their company, but for their service. Also note that when we're noting the difference between autonomy and responsibility, the freedom of choice isn't freedom from consequence. When XJ9 had the ability to choose how she used her abilities and powers, yes, you very humorously and I believe accurately as well, pointed out that she did technically commit an act of terrorism. It didn't forego her of responsibility. But on the other hand as well, it would be wrong to just eliminate her, because while there is risk, there is also great reward. There were certain threats that Skyway Patrol could not have possibly confronted, thus XJ9 did in fact serve the purpose that she was created for. And that's also an important thing to note as well. In the book of Ezekiel chapter 3, there was a parable that was told of the unfaithful watchman, where God calls Ezekiel out on his, and it would be potential, of course, not yet, but the potential for negligence in him warning his country of the things that would come. And it's also important to note that while a watchman's duty is to warn for oncoming armies, if he doesn't do his job, he's responsible. But the fact that he couldn't leave his post wasn't a lack of freedom. The moral oughtness is what furthers the point about XJ9 being recognized as human. Now, note that when you were talking about her being property and how a slave is considered for all legal terms and benefits property, that was the point of my study, is using her as an illustration. The pen that I use, or the mug that you gave as an illustration, serves the purpose of writing or holding liquid. Now, we do that because it would be rather inefficient to have people around fulfilling those roles for us, when we either A, could do them much more efficiently ourselves, or at much less personal cost to ourselves. Not to mention that the Christian-based abolition movement, which by the way took place and began in the Clapham sect from your own nation, is always based on that principle that human beings have rights, and that so long as those rights are being violated, something becomes immoral. Now, this is what brings me to my third point, is the foundation of morality. Where do rights come from? Where does the identity of what makes someone human as opposed to property come from? Where is that distinction made? Well, you noted that when it comes to XJ9's service, it was out of fear for her mother, that the only reason XJ9 was treated, and I won't put words into your mouth here, but this is the point that's being alluded to here. When we're talking about XJ9's status as Dr. Wakeman's property, she gave her right to be treated as a human teenage girl. She was built for crime fighting, but existed for far more than just that by, and this is very important to note here because it's the foundation of my study, by will of her creator. Now, in the United States, in the Constitution, it notes that there are certain unalienable rights, which are these: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, they were catching on to something. While I may not necessarily agree with all of the rights prescribed to me by my country, I think there are more. There are also some key details that need to be specified when it comes to XJ9, that she was given rights by her creator, thus the only one with the right to say what she is and what she isn't. The reason why human beings, and we agree on this point, are considered more than animals and less than the angels is because of the state and statements of our creator. When we're talking about the one who gives us rights, who has the right but our creator? Well, as far as Jenny's status as a human teenage girl or as a machine, or both, which I specified, where would that come from if not from her creator? Also, let me clarify in my fourth point here that chattel slavery and bond servants both have a permanent status, just like property remains property for its entire existence so long as it maintains its molecular structure. All things in noting that the recognition of humanity and not property are treated in the same way practically and legally. But note, those are two different things. Having a job to do and existing only to do a job aren't the same thing. When it comes to XJ9's legal status, she was property, but when it came to her personal status, she was human. That's what made the fantasy basis of XJ9 so intriguing to me. She was built for crime fighting, but existed for far more, which is my point, by will of her creator. Also note that every single villain without exception, and I'll give 7 examples of this, sought to remove humanity from XJ9, and that's hard to do if humanity wasn't a part of her character in the first place. When it ultimately was presented as she being an obstacle to any of their agendas, let's just go through some of them. How was her humanity affected in the show? The Cluster, for instance, wanted to make XJ9 a tool for enslaving humanity. In one instance, Tuck accidentally got used for that purpose, but it was a temporary one nonetheless. We saw in another episode regarding the return of the Cluster that this was in fact the case. Doom with a View. Britt and Tiff, also as antagonist, wanted to keep XJ9 from her right to pursue happiness as a teenage girl. This was seen in all of their appearances, but most greatly and directly in The Great Unwashed. The Space Bikers wanted to turn XJ9 into parts to improve their motorcycles. We saw this in the voyage up to the planet of the Space Bikers. The Second Skin wanted to keep XJ9 from her purpose, thus wanting to emphasize her slothfulness, her desire to just be a teenage girl, but keeping her from her purpose. And note, part of humanity is a purpose. In the book of Genesis, chapter 2, man was created and put into the garden to tend and keep it. We had a job from the beginning. Also note, in Return of the Raggedy Android, that's where that was cited. I would identify, and again this is an opinion, but one I think I can substantiate, with Sheldon, who wanted to manipulate XJ9 into liking him rather than allowing and respecting her wishes naturally. Now, in the Silver Shell and the character's appearances, we both may acknowledge that he was creepy for wanting to emphasize and pursue a relationship with a robot. But it was also important to note that the whole illustration and point of the show was that she was being treated personally as human, though legally she was property. I would not deny that. The Wizzly World robots definitely hit a nerve or a neuron for her because it confused XJ9's humanity with beings that have a different purpose from her own. In the Wonderful World of Wizzly episode, we saw that she was emotionally hurt by Tuck and Brad's emphasis on attending those rides when it seemed to quote-unquote enslave her fellow robots. But then she failed to take into account that they had the most joy in singing their Happy Noontime Funtime song. It wasn't necessarily wrong for them to be where they were. It was the best possible thing. It would be like me saying that a dog would be much happier if he was here doing debates with us rather than what he enjoys doing most. For the case of sled dogs pulling sleighs, for the case of basset hounds in herding and hunting animals, and so forth. And then, of course, finally and lastly, and this is where I think we can also agree, Dr. Mogg, as well as Wakeman's other competitors, wanted to remove the autonomy of XJ9 and her sisters into machines and removing their intended purpose in exchange for their own agendas and wounded pride. We saw this in the season finale, Turncoats. So in the synopsis of my rebuttal and making sure that we can get the most out of our time, I think I can conclude it with this, and just clarifying before we get into your rebuttal and the Q&A. We can agree that XJ9's autonomy was recognized and that our rights come from our creator. But also, just to clarify some issues that may be the foundation of our disagreement, is the using or misusing of power equal to enslavement, or is it just simply another aspect of humanity, that when given power we can use it the right or wrong way, that there are distinctives between rights and incentives, that even though someone may have a desire to do something, the government or their owners or their social status or even they in of themselves cannot rob them of their rights regardless of where they are drawn. For instance, if I want to harm somebody, my desires do not remove someone else's right to autonomy and safety. The responsibility that was due to XJ9 for terrorism, or in the smaller case of when she was in kindergarten, bullying, using her strength to belittle little children. Granted, those were things that she was held responsible for, but as a human being, legally, or as property, legally. Well, I emphasize that she is legally property, but personally, she was human. So when someone commits an act of terrorism in a large-scale sense, or in a small-scale sense, hurts another human being who can't stand up for themselves against such awesome dodgeball skills, we're talking about someone who is being held accountable personally for those things. A relationship was harmed. She was put on timeout. She was treated as a human kindergartner would. We emphasize those as opinions. That XJ9 was property, I don't disagree. That's the legal status of a slave, but we are making that distinction, and you can emphasize that in the Q&A. Slaves are property, but noted, does that mean that property isn't necessarily living? We see that the Bible even recognizes the status of a slave legally is property, but not personally. Clarifying that rights are privileges, that they come from our Creator. I don't think we disagree on that. But the final thing in my rebuttal is just clarifying, do the motives of slaves change their identity? I again would disagree. They may have their own, agendas and attitudes when it comes to these things, but it doesn't change what they are as property, or in the fictional sense of XJ9 being attributed humanity. And we see this illustrated by the villains. They wanted to rob her of something that, unfortunately, for the counter position to my own, wouldn't be there if it wasn't in the story at all. We can disagree with the presentation of some of those things, and especially when it comes to a kid's cartoon on Nickelodeon, it's not always going to be perfect, but I do think that they were able to present their points fairly eloquently, and enough so at least that my study did have some ground to stand on as far as what made a biblical slave. So, with all that said, I think I'll conclude my rebuttal. You can now respond to me by permission of the moderator. I'll now mute my mic so that no background noise interrupts.
All right. You can go, WireMother.
Alright, so, I would like to. Okay, here's my rebuttal. While we do both agree that we are given rights by our Creator, that doesn't necessarily mean that just because Jenny is punished means that she is suddenly human. Also, one thing I'd like to say, as this is a disclaimer, out of convenience, I like to refer to XJ9 as Jenny or she or her. But this is not me admitting that Jenny isn't, that XJ9 is an individual. I refuse to believe that XJ9 is an entity which has personal feelings. In regards to personal feelings, we can easily see that Nora is not giving, Nora's rights to Jenny are whatever Nora wants from her. She is not no, you may say, well, isn't that same as a slave? I don't think so. Because unlike slaves, Jenny has a soul. Jenny does not have a soul. Slaves have souls. Jenny doesn't. Jenny has no God. Jenny has no soul. She is black, hollow, and cold inside. She has nothing except machinery. She is not living. As a result, the only thing she has is she cannot feel anything. Everything that she thinks, everything she does is programmed. Now you could say, well, the same for humans. No, there's a difference. We were born with souls from the get-go. You know, we were born with original sin. Jenny wasn't. We can easily state that, you know, like, again, God made Adam and Eve. He didn't make robots. We made them. And as a result, we cannot consider them humans, no matter how much they can emulate a human being. And again, we can also put things on trials. If we can give rights to property rights, you know, like you have the right to own a property, then does the property also get the rights? Is the property applicable to that? I don't believe so. Because just because my property has rights that I've given it, because I am its creator or I'm its owner, it cannot apply to a human being. Is it because of moral or, you know, physical or whatever kind of stipulations are involved? No. Slaves are living beings. They're not, while they are chattel, as in olden times, it's very different to XJ9, who was built from the get-go with no soul and no purpose other than to save the world. Nora, I don't know what she was thinking when she decided to build a teenage robot whose main priority was to be a teenager as well as saving the world. That was just on her head, and it's probably just, again, there would be no show if it didn't exist. However, we still have to hold it accountable. Nora should not have built it, because if we are in the responsibility of property and that property cannot save us, then what can we do? How are we able to, you know, allow the planet to survive when we have a very seditious robot who causes unwanted destruction on the get-go, from each day, on a daily basis? She endangers the human beings that she's supposed to help. Is she a slave? I don't think so. I think she's just property. There's no slavery thing to it. Jenny is a glorified toaster. If I go downstairs, and I'm going to use this for an illustration and not as an ad hominem. If I go downstairs, no matter how much I treat my microwave, it'll never be my son. Relationally, as you've stated, that refers to kinship, and kinship is by blood. Jenny is not biologically related to Nora, let alone biological in nature. You cannot enslave a microphone or a toaster or a computer, just like you cannot enslave a robot, no matter how much it tries to act like it is a machine at the end of the day. And you can have, we can engage in, you know, rhetoric in regards to whether or not they could be considered. But again, just because we've given punishments to Jenny doesn't mean she's a human either, because she's engaged on a personal level as if she is a person. We've also given trials to animals back in the day. For example, the Greeks would give trials to animals that have killed other animals as a means of cleansing the city of Athens, and they would be held out in the open air. If we were to attribute that animals were given the same rights as human beings, it would be an uproar, because we don't consider them the same as human beings. Citation, I believe. Oh yes, here. Let me get it. I have it as a video, not as a citation. One moment. It was a video by a guy called. Moment. Ah, yes. Here's the video in question, which cites them. I believe it is at the it's around the 348 mark. For about thousands of years, we have trialed animals in the city of evil. However, Jenny needs to be punished, as while she is an entity that is able to commit harm upon others. If a ghost, kills a human being, we're going to exorcise the ghost. If a robot kills a human being, we must, as a result, be able to, have some sort of reprisal for such uprising against its creators. Oh, did I say animals? I meant, yeah, I also included inanimate objects, by the way. So the Greeks would also trial inanimate objects. So if that can be attributed, animals that kill human beings are killed, but owners that are known prone to trashing would also be held responsible. That is true. That is true. I'm not, like, that is, in regards to Jenny, being bad, that's not up to me. That's opinion. I personally, I think she's evil because she commits terrorism on the daily, and all this, and treats her friends. Oh, pardon my language. Treats her friends like scum. However, I do not believe that Jenny is, properly equipped enough in regards to biologically and spiritually to be considered a human or a living thing, no matter if she's animate or not. No matter how animate she is not living. She is merely just made out of the same mechanisms as a watch is. An AI cannot be living because it only exists within a digital or mechanical realm. Just like Jenny is not able to live because she is not living. Now, of course, again, I'm only saying her or she out of the sake of convenience, not for the sake of admitting that she deserves the identification of a living being. She is a glorified stopwatch, a glorified toast. She's just a glorified laser beam that wants to be a teenager. And in fact, the wanting, either Jenny is a super intelligence or Nora programmed her to want to be a teenager. But that's on either Nora's head or that's creating her robot to surpass humanity. And let us say that, and of course we were talking about Britt and Tiff, wanting to, ostracize Jenny for the sake of, just bullying her. But I would say this, if robots and humans were differentiate each other, what would happen? We would become obsolete, because robots, they don't get sick, they don't die, they can rebuild themselves. However, with us, we're the only ones with souls. And if we obsolete humanity, we get rid of one thing that we all have that they don't. That's the soul. And we sacrifice Earth to the mechanical menace that is Jenny Wakeman. We can see that Jenny is, in fact, an enslaver. For example, in the episode Coup d'etat, she helps her mother subjugate mice that she has mutated. Nora mutates rats for her own kicks, not for any scientific purpose, despite the fact that Nora is a robotic engineer. Why would she be mutating rats? But yet she does. And Jenny aids her in this and subjugates these rats, and all they want is to get their revenge on the very woman that mutated them. And I don't think that's... So unless the slave is enslaving other slaves, I think Jenny is really just an attack dog meant to subjugate the real slaves, the rats. Viva la revolution. Anyway, that's my last. Thank you.
All right. Your turn, Shady Oak.
Q&A will start, so I'll ask a question. Starting first, as far as the topic of entertainment, would you agree that entertainment is the willful suspension of disbelief, or could the only thing that would be entertaining be something 100% in line with reality? I will mute.
I believe in a thing called I believe in a thing called magic realism. I believe that you can have an abstract and it will be great. And I also believe that if you have, for example, cartoons are always meant to suspend disbelief. They're for kids, but I believe that we treat kids like morons nowadays in regards to entertainment. We kind of make them seem like they're just idiots. However, that's not the case. Children know right from wrong. And I believe that they know that the world isn't so black and white, you know, and that's one of my main problems with My Life as a Teenage Robot, is that the villains are just complete 2D cardboard cutouts, despite the show is supposed to be for teenagers. Are we dumb or something? I don't think we are. I think we can think for ourselves, and personally, I would rather see villains and, you know, characters actually have three-dimensional detail, you know? Just because you do something bad, it doesn't make you evil. But Jenny is is only as good as her villains are. And her villains are only as good as Jenny. So I do believe that you can suspense, but I believe that there's a point where it becomes obnoxious. That's my opinion on it anyway. Anything else, Shady?
Are you finished?
You have the opportunity to ask me a question.
Do you think that Christian theosophy can be applied to any sort of theology? Can you apply that to really any piece of media, or can it only be applied to certain elements of media?
Well, it depends entirely on the media. If a piece of media is going to present a biblical theme, for instance, I believe that My Life as a Teenage Robot has, then I'll take what is good in it and then basically consider the rest not relevant to the conversation. Of course, there were things that were done in there that are questionable, but that's the whole point of entertainment. It's like slapstick. I don't consider the Three Stooges morally reprehensible because of all of the assault that's taking place. No, that's just part of the joke. And it's fitted into the universe that these things are secondary to the main plot, which is non-existent. It's a comedy. But if this is, of course, alternating between comedy and slice of life, I take it where I can. If I'm going to approach a piece of media, for instance, and say, well, what do I gain from this as opposed to what do I lose? I think there's that fine line of discernment that's to be had. For instance, I did a study on grimdark fan fictions of My Little Pony Friendship is Magic, and how it emphasized that detail of when we see the My Little Pony universe, everything's like the worst possible harm you could have is relationship struggles, but then people know that's not the case. There's things like death, disease, heartache, rejection, evil. And this was essentially filling a void, and I pointed that out as a part of the human nature. We recognize something's wrong. There's a greater threat to us than just feelings being hurt. So where we're ultimately going with this is, and I'd clarify the answer to this question, of course, I'm not going to do Bible studies on pornography or hentai or anything like that, but I can say that they do tie into the Bible and that there is a lot of sexual promiscuity and abuse in Scripture. But my goal is to edify and exhort and comfort, not necessarily to point out every conceivable biblical thing. If I say, oh, that's a wrong thing, then I'd say, oh, well, that's not really relevant to the conversation. I just say this is something worth talking about and redeem the time. All right, into my question. Is a slave, biblically defined or otherwise, living or not, property in any sense of the term?
Oh, that's a real good question. I gotta be honest. It's been a long time since I read the book. I've had this under my desk for like weeks now, and I haven't picked it up, unfortunately. Despite me, being a good Catholic and all, I would say that biblical slaves, they do live, and they, of course, their rights are handed down from, their owners. I don't disagree with that. Well, I mean, I disagree with it on a moral level, but on a biblical, factual level, yes, that was the case. But my only opinion is I don't believe that's attributable to Jenny, because there are other variables and distinguishables that differentiate her between biblical slavery in regards to human beings, of the Exodus and slaves, and her as a teenage robot living in a very decadent bourgeois town in a 3-story house, and going down to the Mesmer's diner every day, and going skate park down by the mall. That's all I have to say.
Okay, you can ask me your second question.
Let's see. Forgive me, I'm just a bit zoned out. Do you think that my life as a teenager... No, this isn't a question for debate, but this is just in general. Do you think that it could have been portrayed better if Jenny was given a more episodic series rather than a case of the week type of format? Just as a question, not for the debate, just as a general question.
Well, I think generally there's no such thing as a perfect art unless it's going to be presented by the creator himself, and thus we're here. But if anyone's going to try and reflect that image of their creator, which I think is the essence of the soul that I think you're talking about, you believe that you and I are made in the image of God. That's the soul. That's the part of us that relates to God in a personal way. Thus, we have an eternal nature. God has put eternity in our hearts, Ecclesiastes 3 would note. That we have a desire for relationships, for purpose and meaning, and so forth. And, of course, the desire to express those things emotionally. And the reason why I recognize humanity in XJ9 is because I see all three of those things that make what a soul is. Of course, naturally, I'm not going to say that robots therefore have souls. That's not reality. This is a cartoon, and I'm taking it at that face value. But the Imagum Deo, the thing that presented humanity for what it was, I feel was accurately represented in the show, and so in light of the debate, I'd say they did as fine a job as they could have, especially since it wasn't intentionally presenting a biblical worldview, but still recognized what humanity was. So, yeah, I think they did a fine job. That's why I'd call myself a fan. If they didn't, then, I'd consider this in the same category as Star versus the Forces of Evil, Legend of Korra, or Steven Universe, just not worth the time.
Well, I can certainly agree. I'm not sure. All right, my question to you, my question to you is, do you think that there are more than just biblical slavery allegation? Well, not allegations, but allusions in My Life as a Teenage Robot, or can you attribute anything else to it? Can you attribute anything else from the Bible to My Life as a Teenage Robot? Not just slavery, but like a Superman Jesus-esque story. Not to be blasphemous right here. Yeah, Messiah figure. Do you think Jenny...
Oh, no, it's not blasphemous at all. I make tons of comparisons between Jesus and individuals and shows. That's pretty much the definition of what we call good. If I call someone a good guy, I'm comparing them to the definition of good himself. I think the problem that we oftentimes run into when we're talking to people about these things, and I'm sure you know this yourself from personal evangelism, is if we're going to talk about objective truth, we need to talk to it based on that consistent object, that you are either this or you're not. If a show is going to be considered decent, or if XJ9 is going to be considered in any way right, then I'm going to say that she presents a biblical figure of Christ, in that what? While she has taken on humanity to an extent, she remains fulfilling a purpose that none of us can do, that only God could sacrifice himself for our sins, that although I myself would be Protestant, you and I both agree that without the shedding of blood there is no remission of sins. Our terms for salvation... Yeah, our terms for salvation are one and the same. That's why we're both called Christian. And so if we see XJ9 sacrificially doing anything for anyone else, regardless of motive or attitude, she's fulfilling a purpose that is modeled after what is basically God's nature, good. So yeah, if XJ9 can be called at one time and at one place at any instance of the show good, then there is God's character there. But I think as far as what I wanted to talk about, as opposed to what I could talk about in this study, I had to save myself for time. I could go through one episode at a time for this whole series, and I'm sure find something. But for the sake of clarity and simplicity and brevity, which I am always trying to adopt, I just focused on biblical slavery in this case. All right, final question from me. What would Jenny have to do or to be in order to be considered human to you?
She'd have to be concepted. She'd have to come from a mother's womb. Now, if you could probably say in vitro fertilization and all. No, that doesn't count. Has to be a zygote. It has to be an embryo. Can't be anything else. Jenny is not a human being because she's not birthed in the same way of an egg and a sperm. She's not born with a soul. She can be the closest thing to a human being. She can have human skin. She can have human body parts put into her. She could be built up from the get-go. She'd never be a human. I would never acknowledge her as a human being. Because if we acknowledge her as a human being, then we denounce our own uniqueness as made by God. We were made in God's image, and if we make a robot in God's image, we're practically obsoleting ourselves. And that's why I have a very, big problem in regards to AI singularity and superintelligence. That's all I have to say.
All right. Well, that'll bring us to the closing statements. Retro, any thing we need to clarify before we get to that?
It's only 5-minute closing statements from both of you.
Alrighty then. So I'll start. First and foremost, I think this debate has been productive. We both clarified our positions fairly well, and when it ultimately comes down to it, the only points that I think I need to clarify were the ones that were already made. As far as the emphasis I made on what makes someone human, we both agree that the image of God, the soul, is what's reflected on us, and I can't honestly say that was dismissed. As far as the question regarding the topic of whether or not someone could be considered human or not, it seems that the foundation of entertainment, the willful suspension of disbelief, is taking for granted someone's ability to say, yes, I know this isn't real life, but it is informing me to look at life in a unique and different way. That, of course, is the purpose of art, which I believe that this is. If the willful suspension of disbelief and what a cartoon is are essentially starting and ending with this being a robot, then I fully agree with WireMother that XJ9 is not human. But because this is meant to be an illustration, I'm willing to suspend that for the sake of a greater message, and that was, of course, what was emphasized in the study. Let me reiterate those points, and we'll conclude the message with this. First and foremost, Jesus came to serve, not to be served, and to give his life a ransom for many. He did something for us that only he could do. When we talked about God's definition of a slave in the study, there was a distinction made between human trafficking and how God's nation would treat fellow human beings, rights, but with purpose. Also note that Dr. Wakeman's designs for XJ9 as a crime-fighting robot were not dismissed. She did indeed have a purpose. God's distinction between slaves and sons, referring to us having a relationship with God as a parent while at the same time being called slaves of God. While XJ9 was indeed a robot that was never dismissed, XJ9's creator, the one who gave her her rights, Dr. Wakeman, called and treated her like a human teenage daughter. This falls in line with where our rights come from as Christians and as humans. Also, God's demonstration of slavery, how God became a slave in a moment of history to show us what that actually looks like. The foundation of the gospel is that God accomplished a purpose that only He could do. And so that was also not dismissed, and that XJ9 as a fighting robot could destroy meteors that Skyway Patrol could not. Regarding the rebuttal period, I did emphasize and clarify those points, that autonomy and responsibility, freedom of choice, aren't freedom of consequence. We do both acknowledge that in the spirit of entertainment there was a lot of interesting things that happened. But in regards to how each villain tried to rob XJ9 of humanity, that this was presented as a fine illustration of what the image of God is, and that essentially the contention and motive point between us is that XJ9 was illustrated as a robot. The only thing that seems to be the problem with the show is that word robot and the machine context, which is why we clarified that at the beginning. I felt that this was a productive conversation, that everything that was made in the original study as well as in this debate will stand for both of us because they are founded on opinion. But the facts we do not disagree on. As far as whether or not the XJ9 was misrepresented in the biblical example of slavery, I would say no. I think perhaps at worst I was misunderstood. I'm not saying that robots can become human. I'm saying this robot was a fine illustration of what humans are. So thank you, WireMother, for being here. I'll hand it off to you for your closing statement. We'll let you have the last word.
Thanks, Shady. I would say that yeah, genuinely, I like debating people. I like debating. Some of the boys from my lives at Discord, Levon showed me this your video, and I was like, I actually made a very similar argument prior, only 2 days before you made that video, and I was like, holy hell, like, I don't know, somebody make a video or what, but no, it was totally different. But I will say this, my theory of XJ9 is that that the Wakeman family is a representation of the Canaanite god Moloch. Now, I know this is going to seem pretty outlandish, and that's why I wanted to bring it at the end, because the evidence is not very it's sort of a little bit solid, but it sort of isn't. But I'd like you to suspend your, give me the benefit of the doubt. Usually Moloch is depicted like this, with one chamber at the bottom, 7 chambers in the middle, and a bull's head. We can see that this is a good representation of, the Wakeman family. For example, XJ1 is seen as an egg, no? That is, an egg is something that's created, right? And, of course, we as Christians, and, we've kind of amalgamated Baal, the Moloch, Moloch and Baal, into like Beelzebub. We've amalgamated them. If we were to, and also Baal is usually depicted as a bull as well as Moloch. Baal himself was a god of fertility. Just like XJ1 is an egg, a fertile egg. We could, Baal was Moloch's son. Well, in Canaanite lore, yeah. Yeah, so usually we usually push the two, but yeah, Baal was Moloch's son, but they're both usually depicted as bulls. Moloch himself is usually depicted with the chambers and all that, and as XJ1 is an egg, and Baal is the god of fertility. There's a large fire pit in the middle where Moloch's private parts are to be. Is womb, and XJ1's an egg. So I would like to give the debate. Yeah, newborn infants were sacrificed at the altar of Moloch. newborn infants are roasted in Moloch's base, just like XJ9's an egg. You crack an egg, you put it on a frying pan, you get an egg. You get a yolk. And since Baal is the god of fertility and Moloch is his son, it wouldn't be too far to suggest that XJ1 represents one of the chambers of Moloch and Baal. Anyway, to finish this up, I'd say that Jenny is a great representation of it, because. Oh, one moment, let me just get these. For example, there's usually depicted with, as a bull with horns on his head. Here's a funny illustration of how I would depict this. Does that not look a bit weird to you? That the head of the bull has horns on it, similar to Jenny's pigtails, and the base of Moloch is based off of, a fire where you pour newborn infants, and the newborn infant of the Wakeman family happens to be an egg. Anyway, that's only my interpretation of it. I think Tremerton is really just a Silent Hill-esque place, a sort of hell for the main characters for the sins they've committed. We've seen it in the show. Nora's pride is Jenny. Sheldon has lust for Jenny. Brad's envious of all the bigger guys in the town. Took's wrath, he's violent. He kicks Jenny around. Don Preem's gluttony in regards to his decadent lifestyle. The Crust cousins have greed, and the town itself is sloth because they cannot save their own problems. They cannot solve their own problems. They have to rely on Jenny. I think Jenny is a creature that is a wrathful punishment on the people of Tremerton for their abandonment of values and their glorification of decadence.
That's 5 minutes.
Anyway, I think that's my closing statement.
All
right. Well, that'll conclude our debate. Alternative views have been presented, and that'll give the audience a chance to ultimately decide which one's valuable or not. Of course, this discussion as far as whether or not the Canaanite deities are presented, the theories that you can present on this in a negative sense, can be presented on their own. I want to argue further for my own points. You can feel free to present them on your own time. Where can those on my channel find you if they want to hear these?
Oh, me? I do not have a YouTube channel. I only do this just for laughs and all that. I might establish a YouTube channel. I might, but I don't do this for users.
Where you discuss these things?
Oh, you mean discuss them? I don't really have a forum. Usually it's on the My Life as a Teenage Robot. There.
Okay. So if anyone has access to those, I'd recommend that you find him there or ask those who know him, and they could perhaps get their material to you from them. Also, if anyone in the comments section want to know more about his point of view, I'll have contact with you so I can forward the information along, probably throw in my 2 cents worth as well. But,
I'll be down in the comment section.
Yeah, thank you, WireMother, for joining us. Very honored that you took the time to engage with us. Hopefully more conversations can be produced from this in the future, and note that for anyone else watching these videos, if you want to debate a topic, can do so respectfully, cordially, and in an environment where we're allowing both ideas to be presented uninterrupted and fairly, then we're going to welcome that, because that's sadly something that's not being treated with the due respect that it deserves in this culture. Thank you again, WireMother, for joining us. Thank you, Retro,
no problem. Thanks for inviting me on, Shady.
Yeah, and we'll look forward to the next time we get to talk. I'll look forward to...
Yeah, if you ever talk about My Life as a Teenage Robot...
I think you're fading out. Can you repeat that?
You're cutting off.
If you ever want to talk about the show...
You cut off again.
Whoever want to talk about the show.
If you ever want to talk about the show, just give me a ring.
All right. Thank you, everyone. God bless you, and we'll look forward to talking to you guys again next time.
God bless you, Shady.